Each position supported the other. If one failed quickly, the other would become far more difficult to maintain. The alliance agreed on this paired defense, not because it guaranteed success, but because it offered the best chance available. Messages were sent out, detailing the plan, assigning responsibilities. Cities were told how many men and ships to provide, where to send them, when to be ready. The decisions made in Corinth began to translate into movement across the Greek world. Within Athens, these decisions required sacrifice. Many citizens owned land outside the city walls, fields that had sustained their families for generations. The strategy now demanded that attention shift away from those lands toward the fleet. Men who might have defended their homes on land took their places on ships instead, accepting that the battle for Athens might not be fought within sight of its streets. In Sparta, the decision to lead on land carried its own weight. Leonidas would march north with a force that could not match the Persians in number, but would rely on discipline and terrain. The presence of a Spartan king at Thermopylae would signal commitment, drawing other allies into the effort. Across Greece, preparations intensified. Farmers left their fields at a critical time of year, trading the certainty of harvest for the uncertainty of war. Young men checked their weapons, repaired straps, ensured that their equipment would hold under strain. Priests conducted rituals, seeking favor from gods whose will was believed to influence outcomes in ways that could not be controlled by human effort alone. The alliance moved forward, not as a unified state, but as a collection of cities bound together by necessity and guided by a shared understanding of what was at stake. It was fragile, shaped by compromise and maintained through constant effort. Yet it was real, and it was enough to set the stage for what would come next. The road north began to fill with men moving toward their assigned positions. The sea saw ships gathering, their crews preparing for engagement. The decisions made in Corinth were no longer theoretical. They were becoming action. And at the center of that action, waiting where mountain and sea narrowed the world into a single line, lay Thermopylae, the place where this fragile alliance would first be tested. The decision to stand at Thermopylae did not emerge from heroism alone. It came from a map laid out in careful thought, from men who understood that courage without position would be crushed beneath weight. The Greek alliance had no illusion about what they faced. They could not meet Xerxes in open ground and expect to hold. They could not scatter their forces across multiple fronts and hope to resist an army that could absorb losses without slowing. What they needed was not a place to win outright, but a place to endure, long enough to change the shape of the war. Thermopylae offered that possibility, not because it was perfect, but because it imposed limits. The pass lay between mountain and sea, its narrowness forcing any army that moved through it to compress, to abandon the advantage of numbers in favor of depth that could not fully engage. The ground itself dictated how men could fight. It reduced choice. It simplified the battlefield into something that could be understood, controlled, at least for a time. The name of the place carried its own quiet detail. Thermopylae, the hot gates, drew its identity from the springs that seeped from the earth nearby, their mineral scent lingering in the air. The ground there was uneven, marked by damp patches and shifting edges where land met water. It was not a place built for comfort. It was a place defined by constraint, by the pressure of natural boundaries that left little room for error. For the Greeks, this was not a weakness. It was the point. In open terrain, the Persian army could deploy its full strength, archers, cavalry, infantry moving in coordinated waves that would overwhelm a smaller force. At Thermopylae, that advantage would be reduced. Only a limited number of attackers could engage at once. The rest would wait behind, their presence adding pressure but not space. The strategy extended beyond land. Just offshore, the waters near Artemisium narrowed in a way that mirrored the pass itself. There, the Greek fleet could meet the Persian navy under conditions that restricted maneuverability. Large numbers of ships could not easily surround or outflank a smaller force. Movement would be constrained, decisions compressed into moments where coordination mattered more than scale. The two positions were inseparable. Thermopylae without Artemisium would be vulnerable to attack from behind, as Persian ships could land troops beyond the pass and trap the defenders. Artemisium without Thermopylae would lack purpose, its efforts disconnected from the land campaign. Together they formed a system, land and sea working in tandem, each reinforcing the other. This understanding shaped every order that followed. Messages carried not just instructions, but intention. Cities were told not only where to send their men and ships, but why those positions mattered. The success of one depended on the endurance of the other. Coordination was no longer optional. It was the foundation of the plan. Yet even with this clarity, uncertainty remained. The Greeks did not know exactly how Xerxes would approach, how quickly he would move, or how he would respond when faced with resistance in such a confined space. They could not predict the full shape of the engagement. They could only prepare for the conditions they had chosen and trust that those conditions would hold. The selection of Thermopylae also carried a psychological dimension. It was a statement, a decision to stand, to meet the Persian advance not by retreating further into the heart of Greece, but by confronting it at the threshold. This mattered not only for the alliance, but for those cities still undecided. A visible stand could influence choices, encouraging resistance where hesitation might otherwise lead to submission. As the plan took form, the movement of men began to align with it. From the Peloponnese, from central Greece, from cities that had committed themselves to the alliance, contingents set out toward the pass. They did not arrive as a single unified force, but in groups shaped by their origins, their leaders, their own internal structures. Each carried its own identity, yet all moved toward the same point. The road north became a thread that gathered these groups together. Dust rose under their steps. Voices carried across distances as men called to one another, sharing news, asking questions, confirming directions. The movement was not silent, but it was purposeful. Each man knew in broad terms where he was going and why. For some, the journey carried a sense of inevitability. They had heard the reports, understood the scale of the Persian advance, and accepted that the stand at Thermopylae would not be easy. For others, the reality remained distant, something that would only become fully clear when they reached the pass and saw it for themselves. Leonidas moved with his Spartan contingent toward this convergence, his presence shaping how others viewed the effort. A Spartan king leading the defense gave weight to the plan, reinforcing the idea that this was not a symbolic gesture, but a serious commitment. Allies who might have hesitated found reason to join, their confidence strengthened by the visible leadership of Sparta. As the first contingents arrived at Thermopylae, they found a place that matched the descriptions they had heard: narrow, constrained, defined by the meeting of land and sea. The old wall that stood there, weathered and broken by time, offered a starting point for preparation. It was not sufficient in its current state, but it could be restored. Work began almost immediately. Stones were lifted, repositioned, fitted together to close gaps and strengthen the line. The labor was physical, direct, carried out by men who would soon rely on that wall as part of their defense. It was not a grand construction, it was a practical one, shaped by urgency and the need to use what was already there. The arrangement of forces took shape alongside this work. Units were assigned positions along the narrow front, their placement determined by both experience and necessity. Spartans, with their reputation for discipline, took key positions where the line would need to hold under the greatest pressure. Allies filled in alongside them, forming a continuous front that stretched across the pass. Communication became essential. Signals were established, commands agreed upon, methods of rotation planned. The men would not fight as individuals, but as parts of a larger formation that required coordination to function effectively. Fatigue would be managed through rotation, with fresh men stepping into the line as others withdrew to rest. Above the pass, the mountains offered both protection and risk. Paths wound through the higher ground, known to locals but less familiar to those from distant cities. These paths could provide an opportunity for the Persians to bypass the main defense if left unguarded. Recognizing this, the Greeks assigned forces, phokins, to watch these routes, their task to prevent any movement that might threaten the rear of the position. The camp settled into a pattern of preparation and waiting. Men sharpened spear points, checked shield straps, adjusted armor to ensure comfort and function. They practiced movements within the confined space, learning how to advance and withdraw without breaking formation. The routines were familiar, yet the context gave them new weight. Beyond the immediate tasks, there was time to think, to consider what lay ahead. Some spoke quietly with those beside them, sharing thoughts that did not need to be expressed loudly. Others remained silent, their focus turned inward, conserving energy, preparing themselves in ways that could not be seen. The sea remained within sight, a constant presence at the edge of the battlefield. Men watched it at times, thinking of the fleet that would soon engage the Persian navy at Artemisium. The success of that effort would influence their own, though they would not see it directly. Trust extended beyond the visible line, linking land and sea through the shared strategy that had brought them here. As the days passed and more contingents arrived, the defense took on a fuller shape. It was not a large force by the standards of what approached, but it was organized, positioned, and prepared in a way that reflected careful planning. The pass itself, once just a narrow stretch of land, had become something else, a chosen boundary, a place where decisions made far away would be tested against the reality of an approaching army. And as the final preparations were made, as the wall stood repaired and the line formed behind it, the men at Thermopylae began to understand that this place, shaped by nature and chosen by strategy, would soon become the point where the weight of the Persian advance met the resolve of those who had chosen to stand. Before the march north had fully taken shape, before the dust of sandals had begun to rise along the roads toward Thermopylae, there was another journey, quieter, deliberate, and bound not to strategy alone, but to belief. In the Greek world, decisions of consequence did not rest solely on logic or necessity. They sought confirmation or warning from something beyond human judgment. And so, as the weight of Xerxes' advance pressed upon Sparta, envoys turned their steps toward Delphi. The path to the sanctuary climbed steadily, winding through terrain that grew cooler as elevation increased. Men arrived early in the day, before the heat settled over the stone steps, carrying with them offerings that reflected both devotion and urgency. Coins, small crafted objects, jars of oil, even animals led carefully through the gathering crowd, each item representing a request, a question shaped by fear or hope. Delphi itself did not impose silence, yet it demanded restraint. Voices lowered as men passed through its gates. The place carried a sense of order that extended beyond the visible. Priests moved with purpose between altars and storerooms, their garments clean, their actions precise. Smoke rose in thin streams from sacrifices, the scent of burned fat clinging to the air, mixing with the sharper smell of the surrounding earth. The Spartans arrived with the same discipline they carried on the road. Their presence did not draw attention through noise or display, but through the quiet certainty of their movement. They followed the established procedures, offering what was required, waiting their turn among others who had come with questions of their own. The system of the sanctuary did not bend to urgency. It operated according to its own rhythm, one that had been followed for generations. Inside the temple, the process tightened. Rituals were performed to prepare the space. Water was used for purification. Hands and objects cleansed in ways that marked the transition from ordinary action to sacred inquiry. Laurel leaves were handled with care, their presence tied to the god whose voice was sought. At the center of this process stood the Pythia, the priestess through whom the oracle spoke. She did not appear as a figure of spectacle. Her role was defined by the ritual, by the structure that surrounded her. Attendants guided her through the steps that prepared her for the moment when the question would be asked and the answer given. Outside, those waiting could hear only fragments, muffled voices, the faint movement within the temple, the occasional sound of an animal before sacrifice. Time stretched in a way that felt different from the urgency of war. Here, decisions were shaped not by speed, but by interpretation. When the Spartans' turn came, their question was framed with the clarity that their society demanded. They did not ask in vague terms. They sought guidance that could be carried back and understood within the structure of their decision-making. War approached. Leadership would be required. The fate of the city itself stood in question. The response, as it was later recorded, did not offer comfort. It did not provide a path free of cost. It presented a choice, stark and unavoidable. Either Sparta would be destroyed, or a Spartan king would die. The words carried weight not because they were dramatic, but because they were clear. They reduced the complexity of the situation into a form that could be acted upon. There was no suggestion of avoiding loss entirely. There was only the question of how that loss would be borne. For Sparta, where law and order shaped every aspect of life, such a statement did not remain abstract. It became part of the decision itself. It could be repeated in council, understood in practical terms, used to resolve debates that might otherwise remain unsettled. A city could accept the death of a king as the cost of survival. To reject that path was to risk something far greater. The envoys carried the oracle's words back across the same roads they had traveled to reach Delphi. Their pace was steady, their purpose clear. Along the way, they passed through towns where the same uncertainty lingered, where people spoke of the Persian advance in tones that shifted between fear and disbelief. The message they carried would not remain confined to Sparta. It would spread, shaping perception beyond its original intent. When they returned, the words were presented within the structures that governed Spartan decision-making. The ephors convened. The council of elders gathered. The envoys spoke plainly, repeating the oracle's message without embellishment. The reaction did not erupt into visible emotion. Spartan custom did not allow for that. Instead, it revealed itself in smaller ways. A tightening of posture, a pause before response, the weight of silence as men considered what had been said. The meaning was understood. It did not require explanation. The discussion that followed did not question the oracle's authority. It focused on what the message demanded in practical terms. If a king must die for Sparta to endure, then the question became which king would lead and how that leadership would be expressed. Leonidas stood within this discussion not as a distant figure, but as a man whose role placed him directly within the choice that had been presented. He listened as others spoke, as the implications were laid out, as the direction of the decision became clear. He did not argue against it. He understood, as those around him did, that the path ahead had been defined not only by strategy, but by something that carried equal weight in their world. The oracle's words did not create the plan to stand at Thermopylae, but they shaped its meaning. What might have been seen as a calculated delay now carried the weight of sacrifice. The presence of a king at the pass was no longer simply a matter of leadership. It was part of a larger understanding, one that aligned duty with outcome. For the men who would march north, the oracle's message became part of the unspoken context of their journey. It was not repeated constantly, but it did not need to be. It existed in the background, shaping perception, influencing how the coming battle was understood. In other Greek cities, the story of the oracle spread with variations. Some heard it as a sign of inevitability, others as a call to courage. Its meaning shifted depending on who interpreted it, yet its presence remained. It added a layer to the narrative of the war, one that extended beyond tactics and numbers. As Leonidas prepared to lead his force toward Thermopylae, the shadow of the oracle moved with him. It did not dictate every action, but it framed the journey in a way that could not be ignored. The road ahead would be shaped by terrain, by strategy, by the movement of armies. But it would also be shaped by the belief that what had been spoken at Delphi carried truth, a truth that would soon be tested in the narrow space where mountain and sea met, and where the cost of resistance would be measured not only in victory or defeat, but in the fulfillment of a prophecy that had already been set in motion. Leonidas did not choose his men in haste, nor did he choose them without meaning. In Sparta, selection was never casual. It followed patterns shaped by tradition, by expectation, by an understanding of what was required not only in battle, but in the moment before battle, when the weight of what lay ahead had to be carried without hesitation. The force he assembled was small, especially when measured against the scale of what approached from the north. 300 Spartans, a number that would later grow in memory, but in that moment remained simply what it was, a chosen group, defined by quality rather than size. They were men in their prime, citizens who had proven themselves through the long discipline of Spartan life. Many had families, wives, children, connections that tied them to the city they were leaving behind. Some later accounts would suggest that Leonidas chose men who had sons, ensuring that their lines would continue. Whether this was strictly true or shaped by later retelling, the effect was the same. These were not men who expected to return unchanged. They understood the nature of the mission, even if they did not speak of it openly. Preparation began with the familiar rituals of readiness. Armor was inspected with care, not for appearance, but for function. Bronze helmets were fitted, their cheek guards adjusted to sit close without restricting vision. Shields were checked for cracks, the wood beneath their surfaces tested for strength. Spears were examined for straightness, their points sharpened to ensure they would not fail at the moment of contact. Short swords were secured as secondary weapons, tools for the close, confined fighting that might come when formations broke and distance collapsed. Each man carried what he needed, and little more. The march would be long enough without unnecessary weight. Provisions were simple, chosen for practicality rather than comfort. Cloaks were rolled or draped depending on the weather, ready to serve as protection against cold nights or sudden rain. Alongside them walked the helots, attendants who carried additional gear and supported the practical needs of the march. Their presence was a quiet reminder of the structure that sustained Spartan society, even in war. They moved with the column, adjusting loads, ensuring that the men they served could maintain their focus on the tasks ahead. When the time came to leave, the departure did not unfold with ceremony. Spartan custom did not favor display. Families gathered, but their expressions were restrained, shaped by expectations that discouraged open emotion. A mother might look at her son, a wife at her husband, and speak words that carried meaning without elaboration. Return with your shield, or on it. The phrase was not a threat. It was a statement of values, a reminder of what was expected. Leonidas led the column out from the city, his presence steady, his pace measured. He did not ride ahead. He walked among his men, sharing the same ground, the same rhythm of movement. The road stretched before them, its direction clear, even if its outcome was not. They moved early, often before the sun had fully risen, when the air remained cool and the ground firm beneath their sandals. The formation held where the road allowed it, breaking into smaller groups when terrain narrowed. Orders were simple and repeated as needed. Keep pace, keep distance, keep moving. The march did not isolate them. Along the way, they encountered other contingents, men from different cities, each with their own leaders and their own understanding of the task ahead. Some joined the column for stretches of the road, their presence adding to the growing sense that this was not a Spartan effort alone, but part of something larger. Reactions to the Spartans varied. Some looked at them with relief, seeing in their discipline a reassurance that the alliance had substance. Others watched with caution, aware that Spartan leadership carried authority that could shape decisions beyond their own control. Leonidas acknowledged these encounters without excess, accepting allies, exchanging brief words with their leaders, and continuing north. The road itself shaped the experience of the march. Villages appeared and passed, their inhabitants watching as the column moved through. The sight was not overwhelming in size, but it carried weight in its purpose. These were not men traveling for trade or routine movement. They were soldiers, their direction clear, their destination understood, even if not spoken aloud. At springs and wells, the column paused briefly. Water was drawn quickly, shared without delay. There was no lingering. The march resumed as soon as the immediate need was met. Time, though not measured in precise terms, remained a constant consideration. Each day brought them closer to the point where preparation would give way to action. In the evenings, the camp formed with practiced efficiency. Fires were lit in controlled spaces, their light kept low. Food was prepared simply, eaten without ceremony. Weapons were kept close, shields within reach even as men rested. Watch rotations were assigned, ensuring that the camp remained secure through the night. Leonidas used these moments not for speeches, but for quiet coordination. He spoke with allied leaders, confirming routes, discussing where their forces would meet at Thermopylae, what numbers they could expect, how they would align once assembled. The conversations were direct, focused on what needed to be done, rather than on what might be said. The men themselves spoke little of what lay ahead, not because they did not think of it, but because the structure of their training did not encourage dwelling on outcomes beyond their control. They focused on the next step, the next day, the immediate reality of the march. In this way, the distance to Thermopylae became something manageable, broken into segments that could be completed without overwhelming thought. As the column moved further north, the land began to change. The air carried a different scent, shaped by the proximity of the sea and the presence of the hot springs that gave the pass its name. The terrain narrowed, the mountains pressing closer, the road itself becoming more confined. When they reached the region near Thermopylae, Leonidas slowed the pace. This was no longer a journey. It was an arrival. The men moved with greater attention to detail, their awareness shifting from the rhythm of travel to the specifics of place. The pass revealed itself not as a dramatic landscape, but as something quieter, defined by its limits. The sea lay close on one side, its surface moving steadily. The mountains rose on the other, their slopes uneven and difficult to traverse. Between them, the narrow strip of land that would soon become a battlefield stretched forward, marked by the remnants of an old wall that had once served as a defense. Leonidas walked parts of the ground on foot, examining it not as a traveler, but as a commander. He looked for the lines where men could stand shoulder to shoulder, where shields could overlap, where spears could reach without obstruction. He noted the firmness of the ground, the places where footing might fail, the points where the enemy might attempt to break through or move around. The work began almost immediately. Stones from the old wall were lifted and set back into place. Gaps filled, the structure reinforced as best as time allowed. The men labored with the same discipline they would soon bring to the fight, their efforts turning a neglected barrier into something that could serve a purpose once more. Allies arrived in growing numbers, their presence expanding the force beyond the initial Spartan contingent. Men from Arcadia, Corinth, Phocis, Thespia, each group bringing its own strength, its own expectations. The pass began to take on a different character, no longer an empty stretch of land, but a gathering point for those who had chosen to stand. Leonidas moved among them, establishing order, assigning positions, ensuring that the structure of the defense reflected both the terrain and the capabilities of those who would hold it. Authority was clear, but it was exercised with an understanding of the alliance's nature. These were not Spartan citizens alone. They were men from different cities, bound together by a shared purpose that required coordination rather than command alone. Above them, the mountain paths were assigned to guards, their task to watch for movement that might threaten the rear. The sea remained in view, a reminder of the fleet that would soon engage the Persian navy nearby. The defense at Thermopylae was not isolated. It was part of a larger effort, one that extended beyond what could be seen from the pass itself. As the final preparations took shape, the march ended and the waiting began. The men who had walked the road now stood in position, their focus shifting from movement to stillness. The ground beneath their feet would not change. The direction of the enemy would not shift. What lay ahead was no longer a journey. It was a stand. And the 300 who had marched from Sparta, now joined by allies from across Greece, stood at the narrow gate, ready to meet what they had come to face. The pass did not transform all at once. It changed gradually, shaped by the presence of men who had come from different cities and now stood together within its narrow limits. What had been a quiet stretch of land, marked by the slow rhythm of wind and water, became something more deliberate. Movement filled the space. Voices carried across short distances. The ground itself bore the imprint of preparation. The old wall, once little more than a reminder of earlier defenses, became the center of that effort. Stones were lifted, adjusted, pressed into place with hands that understood the importance of small details. Gaps that might have allowed passage were closed. Weak sections were reinforced as best as time and materials allowed. The structure did not need to be perfect. It needed to serve as a point of alignment, a place where the line could anchor itself when pressure came. Leonidas oversaw this work not from a distance, but within it. He moved along the length of the wall, observing, speaking briefly where necessary, ensuring that the effort remained focused. His presence did not require constant instruction. The men understood what was needed, yet his attention gave weight to the task, reinforcing that this was not preparation for an uncertain possibility, but for an event that would arrive. The Greek force grew as more contingents reached the pass. What had begun with the Spartans expanded into a gathering of allies, each group bringing its own character. Arcadians arrived with men accustomed to rough terrain. Corinthians added numbers and experience. Phocians, familiar with the surrounding landscape, took on roles that required knowledge of the mountain paths. Thespians came with a quiet determination that would later define their place in the story. The total number of defenders stood in the thousands, far more than the 300 Spartans who would later dominate memory. Yet even this larger force remained small compared to what approached. The imbalance was understood. It shaped every decision, every arrangement of men along the line. Command had to be clear. Leonidas held authority as the Spartan king, a role accepted by the alliance as part of the agreement made at Corinth. Yet each contingent retained its own leadership, its own internal structure. The challenge lay not in issuing orders, but in ensuring that those orders were understood and followed across differences of language, custom, and expectation. Leonidas addressed this directly. He spoke with allied leaders not in long speeches, but in precise instructions. Where units would stand, how the line would rotate, what signals would indicate movement or change. The simplicity of these instructions reflected their importance. In the confined space of the pass, confusion could break a defense as surely as any attack. The arrangement of the line took shape with care. Spartans occupied key positions where discipline would be most critical. Their experience in maintaining formation under pressure made them suited to the narrow front where the enemy would first engage. Allies filled in alongside them, creating a continuous barrier of shields and spears that stretched across the pass. Behind the front, space was limited, but used with purpose. Men rested when they could, knowing that fatigue would come quickly once fighting began. Weapons were kept close, ready to be taken up at a moment's notice. Attendants moved through the camp, carrying water, adjusting equipment, ensuring that nothing essential was overlooked. Above the pass, the mountain paths demanded attention. The Phocians were assigned to guard these routes, their familiarity with the terrain making them the natural choice. They moved into position along the trail that wound through the heights, their task to watch, to listen, to prevent any movement that might threaten the rear of the Greek position. The importance of this assignment was understood, though its consequences would only become clear later. For now, it was another part of the system, another layer of defense that completed the plan. The sea remained a constant presence, visible from parts of the pass, its surface reflecting the changing light. Men looked toward it at times, thinking of the fleet at Artemisium. News traveled between land and sea through runners and signals, though never with perfect clarity. The connection was real, yet distant. The success of one depended on the endurance of the other. The camp settled into a rhythm shaped by waiting. Men sharpened their spears with small, repetitive motions, the sound of stone against metal carrying softly through the air. Shields were inspected again and again, straps tightened, grips adjusted. Armor was worn, removed, and worn again, ensuring that it would not hinder movement when the time came. Practice filled the hours. Not elaborate drills, but focused repetitions of what would be required in the narrow space. Advancing a step, holding the shield steady, thrusting with the spear, withdrawing without breaking formation. Each movement was simple on its own. Together, they formed the discipline that would define the defense. There were moments of stillness as well, times when men sat or stood without speaking, their thoughts turned inward. Some considered the reports they had heard, the scale of the army that approached. Others focused only on the immediate present, conserving energy, avoiding the distraction of speculation. Scouts moved north from the pass, their task to watch for the first signs of the Persian advance. They traveled light, returning with reports that grew more frequent as the days passed. The enemy was close, closer than before. The distance could now be measured not in long journeys, but in the time it would take for an army to cover the ground between them. Each report tightened the atmosphere within the camp. The waiting took on a different quality, no longer open-ended, but directed toward a specific moment that could arrive at any time. Men adjusted their gear more often. Officers moved through the ranks with greater attention, ensuring that positions could be taken quickly. Leonidas used this time to reinforce what mattered. He did not speak of victory in grand terms. He spoke of holding the pass, of maintaining formation, of doing what had been planned. The clarity of his approach left little room for doubt. The task was defined. The outcome would depend on how well it was carried out. As the sun rose and set over the pass, marking the passage of days that felt both long and short, the Greek force remained in place. The wall stood repaired. The line was formed. The men were ready as they could be. Beyond the bend in the road to the north, unseen but no longer abstract, the Persian army continued its approach. Scouts would soon give way to vanguards to the full presence of a force that would fill the space before the pass with movement and sound. For now, there was still a measure of quiet. The wind moved across the land. The sea continued its steady rhythm. The men stood where they had chosen to stand, their preparations complete, their attention fixed on what would come next. The pass was no longer just a place. It was a line, and it was held. The first sign of the Persian army did not arrive with noise. It came in fragments, small movements at the edge of sight, shapes that resolved slowly into men. Scouts appeared first, riding ahead of the main force, their pace controlled, their attention fixed on the narrow stretch of land that lay before them. They did not rush forward. They observed. They measured. They watched the Greek line and the rebuilt wall, taking in details that would be carried back to their commanders. From the Greek position, these first figures marked a transition. The waiting that had defined the days before gave way to something more immediate. Men adjusted their grips on spears, shifted their weight behind shields, narrowed their focus to the space ahead. The presence of the enemy was no longer a report or a possibility. It was visible, real, approaching. The scouts withdrew as they had come, turning their horses and disappearing back along the road. In their place, the vanguard began to appear, not all at once, but in a steady flow that filled the distance with movement. Infantry came first, then cavalry, then more infantry, the line stretching beyond what could be seen from the pass. The ground itself seemed to change as they arrived, the quiet replaced by the layered sounds of an army establishing itself. The Persian camp formed with practiced efficiency. Tents rose in ordered sections. Fires were lit. Units settled into positions that reflected their organization. Officers moved among them, issuing commands, receiving reports, ensuring that the structure of the force remained intact even as it came to rest. To the Greeks, the scale became clearer with each passing hour. What had been described in reports now stood before them in visible form. The number of men, the variety of equipment, the constant movement within the camp. These details combined into a presence that could not be ignored. It was not chaos. It was controlled, deliberate, and vast. Xerxes himself arrived and took a position from which he could observe the pass. He had expected resistance, but the sight of the Greeks standing in place, their line formed and their wall restored, presented a choice. He could attack immediately, testing their defense with force. Or he could wait, allowing the weight of his army's presence to influence their decision. He chose to wait. For several days, the Persian army remained in position, its size visible, its potential clear. The expectation was simple. The Greeks, seeing the scale of what they faced, would withdraw. There would be no need for battle if fear accomplished what force otherwise would. But the Greeks did not leave. Within the pass, the waiting continued, now under the gaze of the enemy. The tension shifted, no longer abstract but immediate. Men stood at the wall, their attention fixed on the Persian camp. They watched the movement of units, the formation of lines, the patterns that suggested preparation. They did not speak loudly. They did not break formation. The discipline that had shaped their preparation now defined their stillness. Xerxes sent a messenger, a formal demand carried under the expectation of response. The terms were clear, framed in the language of empire. Surrender. Lay down your arms. Accept the authority of the Persian king and live. Refusal would bring destruction. The messenger approached the Greek line with caution. stopping at a distance that allowed communication without immediate threat. Greek officers stepped forward to meet him. Among them stood Leonidas, his presence steady, his attention fixed not on the spectacle of the moment, but on the meaning behind it. The exchange was brief. The demand was delivered. The response came without delay. When asked to lay down their weapons, Leonidas answered simply, "Come and take them." The words did not echo. They did not need to. Their meaning was clear. The Greeks would not yield their position. Any attempt to take it would require force, in the narrow space where that force could not be fully applied. The messenger returned to Xerxes with the reply. The waiting ended. The Persian army began to move with new purpose. Units formed into columns, their alignment shifting from rest to action. Commands carried across the camp, horns signaling the transition from preparation to attack. The first assault would test the Greek line, probing for weakness, seeking to break the defense quickly and decisively. On the Greek side, the response was equally deliberate. Leonidas ordered the line to hold, rotations prepared, reserves positioned to replace those who would tire in the front. The men adjusted their stances, shields raised, spears angled forward. The wall behind them provided a point of reference, but the defense extended beyond it, shaped by the formation itself. The first Persian troops advanced in controlled formation, their pace steady as they crossed the open ground toward the pass. They carried lighter shields than the Greeks, their equipment suited for mobility and range. Archers moved behind them, ready to support the advance with volleys that could disrupt the defenders. As they reached the narrow front, the pace increased. The distance closed quickly, the open ground giving way to the confined space where the two forces would meet. The impact was immediate. Persian troops struck the Greek line with momentum, expecting to break through by force of numbers and movement. Instead, they met a wall of shields and a line of spears that extended forward in a dense, controlled formation. The Greek hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping, their spears thrusting in unison. The first ranks of the attackers fell quickly, their advance halted by the reach of the Greek weapons. Those behind pressed forward, driven by momentum and command, but found themselves constrained by the same narrow space. They could not deploy their full strength, they could not maneuver freely. They could only push into the line and fight within the limits imposed by the terrain. The fighting became close and immediate. Spears struck, withdrew, struck again. Shields absorbed blows, their weight used to push back against the pressure of the attack. The ground beneath the fighters shifted as bodies fell, creating uneven footing that made movement more difficult with each passing moment. The Persian archers attempted to support the assault, their arrows rising and falling into the confined space. Some found their mark, striking exposed areas, slipping past shields or glancing off armor. Many struck the bronze and wood of the Greek defense, their impact reduced by the angle and distance. Leonidas moved along the line where he could, his attention focused on maintaining cohesion. He watched for signs of fatigue, for moments when the pressure might create gaps. When men in the front began to tire, others stepped forward, replacing them in a rotation that allowed the line to remain strong. The Persian commanders responded by sending in additional waves, fresh troops replacing those who had fallen or been forced back. The pattern repeated: advance, impact, resistance. Each attempt met the same result. The narrow space prevented the Persians from bringing their full numbers to bear, turning their advantage into pressure without space to use it effectively. The sound of the battle filled the pass. The clash of metal, the strain of effort, the shouted commands that carried over the noise, all combined into a constant presence that left little room for thought beyond the immediate moment. As the day progressed, the ground before the Greek line became crowded with bodies and broken equipment. Persian soldiers attempted to clear space, dragging the fallen away to allow the next wave to advance. Some succeeded, Others fell in the attempt, adding to the growing obstacle that both sides had to navigate. The Greeks held. Their formation remained intact, their movements controlled, their discipline unbroken despite the continuous pressure. They did not advance beyond what the situation required. They did not pursue. They held their ground, using the pass as it had been intended, a place where fewer could resist more. Xerxes watched as the first assaults failed to achieve their purpose. The expectation of a quick breakthrough gave way to recognition that the defense was stronger than anticipated. He responded by committing additional forces, increasing the pressure, seeking to overwhelm through persistence, if not through immediate force. Yet the result remained the same. As the sun moved across the sky and the heat settled over the battlefield, the Persian attacks slowed. The cost had been high, the progress minimal. The decision was made to withdraw for the day, to regroup and reconsider the approach. The Persian troops pulled back, leaving the ground before the pass marked by the evidence of the fight. The Greek line remained in place, their shields still raised, their formation intact. When the pressure eased, the men did not relax entirely. They adjusted their grips, cleaned their weapons as best they could, checked their equipment for damage. Water was passed forward. Wounded men were moved to the rear, their injuries tended with whatever means were available. Leonidas gathered his officers briefly. The discussion focused on practical matters. The line had held. The enemy would return. The same discipline would be required again. As the light began to fade and the shadows lengthened across the pass, the first day of battle came to an end. Fires were lit in both camps, their glow visible in the growing darkness. The sounds of preparation replaced the sounds of combat, yet the tension remained, carried into the night. The Greeks had held against the first assault, but the army before them had not diminished in purpose, and the pass, now marked by blood and broken ground, would see the same test again with the coming of the next day. Dawn did not bring relief. It brought repetition. The same ground, now marked by the previous day's struggle, waited beneath a rising sun that revealed what darkness had briefly concealed. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some already moved aside, others still caught in the narrow space where the fighting had been most intense. The air carried a different weight now, heavier with the smell of sweat, metal, and the lingering presence of death. Yet the men who stood at the pass did not pause to dwell on it. There was no time for reflection. The day ahead demanded the same discipline as the one before. The Greeks took their positions early, stepping into place with a familiarity shaped by experience. The line formed again, shields raised, spears angled forward. Attendants moved behind them, passing water, adjusting equipment, ensuring that each man was as ready as he could be. Some of the wounded from the previous day returned to the line, their injuries bound, their presence a quiet statement that the defense would not weaken easily. Among the Spartans, small rituals continued, gestures that seemed almost out of place in the context of war. A few combed their hair, smoothing it back beneath their helmets. The act was not vanity, it was habit, a reflection of order maintained even in the face of danger. To the allies who watched, it carried a different meaning. It suggested calm, a refusal to let the approaching battle disrupt the structure that defined them. Across the open ground, the Persian camp stirred into motion once more. The sounds of preparation rose quickly, horns signaling, officers calling commands, the movement of men assembling into formation. Xerxes had watched the first day's failure, had seen wave after wave break against the Greek line without achieving the desired result. The second day would not be a repetition without adjustment. He expected progress, and his commanders understood that expectation. The first assaults came sooner, with less waiting than before. Persian troops advanced in dense formations, their pace increasing as they approached the narrow front. The intent was clear: close the distance quickly, apply pressure before the Greeks could fully settle into their rhythm. The impact, when it came, carried the same force as before, but the Greeks were ready for it. The front ranks absorbed the initial push, shields locking together, spears thrusting forward in controlled, practiced movements. The narrow space again dictated the terms of the fight. The Persians could not spread out, could not use their numbers to surround or overwhelm. They could only press forward into the confined line where each man had limited room to act. Leonidas adjusted his approach as the day unfolded. Where the first day had focused on holding the wall, the second introduced movement within the defense itself. At times, the Greeks stepped forward beyond their initial position, engaging the Persians slightly deeper into the pass, then withdrawing in controlled order to reset their line. The maneuver served multiple purposes. It cleared space clogged by the fallen, disrupted the rhythm of the attackers, and allowed fresh men to rotate into the front with greater ease. The execution of this movement required precision. A single misstep could create a gap, and a gap could become a break. Yet the Greeks moved with coordination, their training evident in the way they advanced and withdrew as a unit. Shields remained aligned, spears maintained their reach, and the line reformed quickly after each shift. The Persians responded with increased intensity. Fresh troops were sent forward in greater numbers, their commanders attempting to find points of weakness, to apply concentrated pressure where the Greek line might falter. Hooks were used in attempts to pull shields aside. Hands reached to grasp spear shafts, to disrupt the rhythm of the defense. Yet each effort met resistance, shaped by discipline rather than individual reaction. The Greeks did not respond with disorder. They responded with the same controlled movements that had held the line before. Arrows continued to fall, their impact a constant presence in the battle. Some struck shields and helmets, deflected or absorbed. Others found openings, wounding men who were quickly replaced in the line by those behind them. The formation adapted, closing gaps as they appeared, maintaining its integrity despite the continuous pressure. As the day progressed, Xerxes committed his elite forces, the Immortals, to the fight. These were troops distinguished by their equipment and training, expected to succeed where others had failed. They advanced with confidence, their formation tighter, their movements more coordinated. Officers cleared paths for them, ensuring that they reached the front where their skill could be applied directly. The clash that followed carried a different intensity. The Immortals pressed forward with determination, their attacks focused, their attempts to break the line more deliberate. They sought to exploit any weakness, to force a breakthrough that could unravel the Greek defense. Yet the terrain remained unchanged. The pass still constrained movement, still limited the number of attackers who could engage at once. The Greeks met the Immortals with the same tools they had used against earlier waves, shields locked, spears thrusting, bodies moving in unison. The advantage of elite training did not translate into dominance within the confined space. At moments, the fighting closed to such distance that spears became less effective. Men drew their swords, shorter weapons suited for the crush of bodies. Blades struck at close range, finding gaps in armor, cutting where shields could not fully protect. The sound of metal on metal grew sharper, more immediate. Leonidas maintained the structure of the defense, ensuring that even as the intensity increased, the line did not lose cohesion. He moved where he could, reinforcing positions, directing rotations, keeping the focus on the task rather than the chaos of the moment. The Persians pressed harder, their efforts growing more urgent as the day wore on. The expectation of a breakthrough remained, yet it continued to elude them. The ground before the pass became increasingly difficult to navigate, bodies and broken equipment creating obstacles that slowed movement and disrupted formation. By midday, the battle had taken on a rhythm that felt both relentless and controlled. Waves of attackers advanced, met resistance, withdrew or fell, replaced by new waves. The Greeks responded with consistency, their discipline preventing the kind of collapse that the Persians sought to provoke. Fatigue began to show on both sides. Arms grew heavy, movements less precise. The strain of continuous fighting took its toll, even on those trained for endurance. Yet the structure of the Greek defense allowed for rotation, for moments of rest that prevented exhaustion from breaking the line entirely. As the sun began to lower, the Persian assaults slowed once more. The second day, like the first, had failed to produce the desired result. The Greek line still held, its formation intact despite the pressure applied against it. Xerxes withdrew his forces again, the decision driven not by lack of effort, but by the recognition that persistence alone would not achieve immediate success. The cost of continued assaults without adjustment had become clear. In the Greek camp, the response mirrored the previous evening. Men remained alert, their focus not on celebration, but on preparation. Weapons were cleaned, repairs made where possible. Wounded were treated, their injuries managed with limited resources. Water was passed, food consumed in small portions that would sustain rather than satisfy. Leonidas met briefly with allied leaders, the discussion grounded in practical concerns. The enemy would return. The pattern might change. The defense would need to adapt while maintaining its core strength. Above the pass, the Phocians remained at their posts, watching the mountain path, listening for movement that might signal a different kind of threat. The importance of their role remained understood, though the danger it represented had not yet revealed itself. As night settled over Thermopylae, the second day of battle came to an end. The fires of both camps flickered in the darkness, their light reflecting off armor and weapons set aside for a few hours of rest. The Greeks had held again. But the nature of the conflict was shifting. The Persians had learned that the pass could not be taken easily from the front. And somewhere beyond the visible line, a different path, one that did not rely on direct assault, waited to be found. The second night did not carry the same stillness as the first. The air itself seemed to hold something unresolved, as if the failure of 2 days' assault had shifted the shape of the conflict without yet revealing what would come next. In the Persian camp, the fires burned as before. Men ate, rested, spoke in low voices. Yet beneath that routine, there was movement, quieter, more deliberate, guided by a purpose that did not need to be announced to every soldier. He came after dusk, not as a soldier, not as part of any organized unit, but as a man who knew the land. Ephialtes. His name would be carried forward in memory with a weight far greater than his presence suggested that night. He walked with caution, aware that he approached an army that would not hesitate to cut him down if he were mistaken for a threat. Guards stopped him, questioned him, brought him forward through the ordered lines of tents where officers listened to what he had to say. He spoke through interpreters, his words shaped by urgency and opportunity. There was a path, he said, one that wound through the mountains above the pass. It was not hidden, not unknown to those who lived nearby, but it was not a road that an army would find without guidance. It led behind the Greek position. A force could use it to outflank the defenders, to reach the rear of the pass, where the narrow front no longer provided protection. The Persian officers did not accept his claim without question. They asked for details, turns in the path, landmarks, distances, the nature of the terrain. Ephialtes answered with specificity, his knowledge consistent with what scouts and local reports had suggested. The path existed. It was guarded, but not heavily. The men assigned to it were not Spartans. They were Phocians, positioned to watch rather than to withstand a determined assault. For Xerxes, the offer aligned with the need that had emerged from 2 days of failure. The frontal assault had proven costly and ineffective. The Greeks had chosen their ground well, and their discipline had turned that choice into a barrier that could not be broken by force alone. This path offered a different solution, not through strength, but through position. The decision was made quickly. A detachment was selected, composed of troops capable of moving through difficult terrain with speed and coordination. They carried lighter equipment, suited for the climb, their weapons chosen for mobility rather than sustained engagement. A trusted commander was placed in charge, his task clear. Follow the guide, reach the rear of the Greek position, and complete the encirclement that would end the stalemate. The movement began under cover of darkness. The detachment left the main camp quietly, their departure unnoticed by most, their path leading away from the open ground and into the rising slopes of the mountains. Ephialtes walked at the front, his steps sure, his knowledge of the terrain guiding the column through turns that would have confused those unfamiliar with the path. The trail climbed steadily, its surface uneven, marked by loose stones that shifted underfoot. Trees grew close in places, their branches narrowing the passage, forcing the men into single file. The night air carried the sounds of movement differently here. The soft scrape of sandals on rock, the faint clink of metal, the controlled breathing of men maintaining their pace. The Persian soldiers moved with discipline, their training allowing them to maintain formation even in the confined space. Commands were given in low tones, gestures used where words might carry too far. They understood the importance of silence, of reaching their objective without alerting the defenders below. Higher along the path, the Phocians held their position. Their task had been clear: guard the route, prevent any movement that might threaten the rear of the pass. They had maintained their watch through the previous days, listening for signs of activity, observing the terrain with the familiarity that came from living in the region. They heard the Persians before they saw them. At first, the sound was faint, easy to mistake for the natural movement of the night. Then it grew clearer, the rhythm of many feet, controlled but unmistakable. The Phocians reacted quickly, gathering into formation, their movements hurried but purposeful. When the Persians emerged from the darkness, the encounter was immediate. Arrows were loosed, the first exchange carried out at a distance that closed rapidly as both sides moved toward contact. The Phocians fought, their position giving them a brief advantage as they held higher ground. Yet the Persian detachment was larger, more numerous, and driven by a clear objective that did not require them to engage fully with the defenders. The Phocians, recognizing the pressure against them, made a decision shaped by instinct and terrain. They withdrew to a higher position, expecting the Persians to pursue them upward. Instead, the main body of the Persian force continued along the path, leaving a portion behind to contain the Phocians, while the rest moved toward the descent that would lead to the rear of the pass. The realization came too late. From their elevated position, the Phocians could see the column stretching below them, moving with purpose, not toward them, but past them. The path they had been assigned to guard had been breached, not through defeat alone, but through a shift in the nature of the attack. A runner was sent immediately, descending as quickly as the terrain allowed, carrying the message that would change everything. The Persians were on the path. They were moving behind the Greek position. Before dawn, the Persian detachment reached the far side of the mountains and began its descent toward the road that lay beyond the pass. The terrain shifted again, the slope easing, the trees thinning to reveal glimpses of the land below. The first light of morning began to touch the edges of the landscape, outlining the shapes of men and weapons as they moved. Below, at Thermopylae, the Greek camp remained in its night routine. Guards stood at their posts, men rested in short intervals, their sleep shallow, shaped by the expectation of another day of battle. The sounds of the Persian camp to the north had become familiar, part of the background of the past 2 days. The message arrived not as a gradual realization, but as a direct report. The runner reached the camp breathless, his words carrying urgency without embellishment. The enemy was behind them. The path had been taken. The position at Thermopylae was no longer secure. Leonidas received the report as the first light of day began to reveal the outlines of the pass. He did not react with visible alarm. The information was clear, its implications immediate. The strategy that had defined the defense, the reliance on the narrow front, had been compromised. He called the Allied leaders together, gathering them near the wall where the line had held for 2 days. The discussion that followed did not dwell on how the situation had changed. It focused on what could be done next. The Persians would soon attack from both directions. The position could not be held in the same way as before. The choices were limited: stay and fight under conditions that offered little chance of survival, withdraw while there was still time, preserving forces for future battles. Each option carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment. The men listened as the situation was explained, as the reality of the new threat settled over them. The quiet of the previous nights had been replaced by something else, a recognition that the balance of the battle had shifted, that the narrow gate they had held was no longer a barrier in the same way. As the sun rose higher, the outlines of the mountains became clearer, and with them, the understanding that the enemy now occupied the ground that had once been their protection. The betrayal had not ended the battle. It had changed it. And the stand at Thermopylae, which had begun as a defense shaped by terrain and discipline, now faced a different test, one where the ground itself could no longer offer the same advantage, and where the decisions made in the next moments would determine not only the outcome of the battle, but the meaning it would carry forward. The message did not linger in uncertainty. It settled quickly, firmly, leaving no space for doubt. The Persians were behind them. The narrow advantage that had defined the previous days was gone, replaced by a reality that could not be shaped back into its earlier form. Thermopylae was no longer a gate that could be held from the front alone. It had become a place of encirclement. Leonidas stood with the Allied leaders as the implications unfolded. There was no time for prolonged debate, no room for competing strategies that required distance or delay. The situation demanded clarity. The options were few, and each carried weight. He gave the order for the majority of the Greek forces to withdraw. It was not a command shaped by fear, but by necessity. The alliance had been built to resist, not to be destroyed in a single moment. To remain with the full force at the pass would mean losing everything: men, leadership, the ability to continue the fight elsewhere. By sending the allies away, Leonidas preserved what could still be used in the larger war. The reaction varied. Some left quickly, understanding the logic of the decision, the need to carry the fight beyond Thermopylae. Others hesitated, reluctant to abandon a position they had held, to leave behind those who would remain. Among them were the Thespians, who chose not to depart, their decision shaped by a sense of commitment that matched the gravity of the moment. The Spartans did not move. Their place had been defined before the order was given. They would stay. The numbers shifted as the withdrawal took place. Where thousands had stood, now only a fraction remained: Spartans, Thespians, and a small contingent of Thebans whose presence carried its own complexity. The line that had stretched across the pass contracted, becoming more concentrated, more focused. The atmosphere changed with that movement. The noise of departure, footsteps, voices, the movement of men gathering their equipment faded gradually, replaced by a quieter, heavier stillness. Those who remained adjusted their positions, their awareness sharpened by the knowledge that what came next would not be a repetition of the previous days. Leonidas moved among his men, not to rally them with grand words, but to ensure that the structure of the defense remained intact. He spoke to officers, confirmed positions, checked that the line was ready to hold, even as the conditions had changed. His presence was steady, his actions measured. The first signs of the Persian advance came from both directions. From the north, the main army prepared to attack once more, its formations assembling with the expectation that the defense would be weaker, its advantage diminished. From the south, the detachment that had crossed the mountain path descended toward the rear of the Greek position, closing the distance that would complete the encirclement. The Greeks adjusted their formation to face this new reality. The line turned, extending in both directions where possible, creating a position that could respond to attacks from front and rear. The wall still stood, but it no longer defined the entirety of the defense. The battle would now unfold across a space that could not be contained as before. When the Persians advanced, the clash came with greater intensity than on previous days. There was no waiting, no expectation of surrender. The attack began with force, driven by the understanding that the position could now be broken. The Spartans and their allies met that force with the same discipline that had held the pass before. Shields locked, spears thrust, the line moved as one. The narrow ground still limited the number of attackers who could engage at once, but the pressure from multiple directions created a different kind of strain. There was no longer a single front to hold. There were two. The fighting grew closer, more immediate. Spears broke under repeated impact, their shafts splintering, their points lost or bent. Men drew their swords, the shorter blades better suited for the confined space where bodies pressed together. The sound of combat sharpened, metal striking metal, the impact of shield against shield, the breath of men exerting themselves beyond ordinary limits. Leonidas fought within the line, not apart from it. His position was not symbolic, it was practical, shaped by the same expectations that defined every Spartan warrior. He moved where he was needed, reinforcing the defense, maintaining the cohesion that allowed the smaller force to resist the larger one for as long as possible. At some point within the chaos of the fighting, Leonidas fell. The exact moment is not preserved with certainty, but the effect was immediate. The death of a king did not end the battle, but it marked a shift. The prophecy carried from Delphi had found its fulfillment, though the men who fought did not pause to consider it. Their focus remained on the line, on the enemy before them, on the next movement that would keep the defense from collapsing. The Spartans fought to recover his body, their efforts driven by a mixture of duty and instinct. They pushed forward, reclaiming the ground where he had fallen, forming a protective circle around him, even as the pressure of the Persian attack increased. The act was not strategic in the broader sense. It was immediate, rooted in the values that shaped their identity. As the battle continued, the Greek position contracted further. The remaining defenders withdrew toward a small rise within the pass, a place where they could form a final line that faced outward in all directions. The terrain no longer offered the same advantage it had before, but it provided a point of focus, a place where the last stand could be made with some measure of structure. The Persians surrounded them, their numbers filling the space beyond the Greek line. Archers were brought forward, their role now central to the final phase of the battle. The order was given, and arrows rose into the air in dense volleys, darkening the sky before descending into the confined space where the Greeks stood. The defenders raised their shields as best they could, but the volume of fire made protection incomplete. Arrows struck armor, pierced gaps, found their mark in places where defense could not fully cover. The line held for a time, even under this assault, men continuing to fight, to stand, to resist, despite the inevitability that had begun to define the moment. One by one, they fell. Spartans, Thespians, those who had chosen to remain when others withdrew. They fought until their strength was gone, until the structure that had held them together could no longer be maintained. The battle ended not with a single decisive blow, but with the gradual collapse of resistance under overwhelming force. The final defenders were cut down where they stood, their position overrun by the numbers that had been held at bay for 2 days and now closed in from all sides. When it was over, the pass was no longer a line. It was ground marked by what had taken place there. Bodies, broken weapons, the remnants of a defense that had held beyond expectation before yielding to the conditions that had changed around it. The Persian army moved through Thermopylae at last. The path to central Greece opened before them. The immediate objective had been achieved. The resistance of the pass had ended. Yet what remained was not only the outcome, but the manner in which it had been reached. The stand at Thermopylae had not stopped the invasion. It had not destroyed the Persian army, but it had demonstrated something that would carry beyond the battlefield. A measure of resistance shaped not by victory, but by the decision to hold, to stand, to fight under conditions where the outcome was never in doubt. And in that narrow space between mountain and sea, where the ground had forced men into a single line, the story that would be remembered had taken its form. When the Persian army moved past Thermopylae, the land ahead did not resist in the same way. The narrow gate that had slowed them, that had forced their strength into a confined space, was behind them now. The road opened, stretching southward into the heart of Greece. Villages lay along that path, then towns, then cities, whose fate would be shaped not by whether the Persians arrived, but by how they chose to respond when they did. The immediate result of the battle was clear. The defense at Thermopylae had been broken. The Greek force that had held the pass was gone, its surviving allies withdrawn, its remaining defenders fallen where they had stood. The Persian army continued its march, its objective unchanged, its momentum restored. Yet the effect of what had happened did not end with the clearing of the pass. News of the battle traveled quickly, carried by those who had left before the final stand, by messengers sent ahead, by the natural spread of information through a network of roads and connections that linked the Greek world. The story did not arrive as a simple report of defeat. It arrived with detail of how the Greeks had held for 2 days, of how the narrow ground had limited the Persian advantage, of how the final stand had unfolded when escape remained possible for some. The details varied with each telling, shaped by perspective, by distance, by the need to make sense of what had occurred. Yet the core remained consistent. A small force had resisted a far larger one, and had done so with a discipline that had not broken until the conditions of the battle itself had changed. In cities that had committed to resistance, the effect was immediate. The fall of Thermopylae confirmed what had always been understood, that the Persian advance could not be stopped by a single engagement. Yet it also provided something else. It showed that resistance was possible, that the Persian army, despite its size, could be held, delayed, forced to expend time and effort in ways that mattered. Athens received the news with a clarity shaped by its own preparations. The city had already begun to shift its focus toward the sea, its fleet gathering strength, its people adjusting to the possibility that the land itself might not be held. The stand at Thermopylae reinforced that direction. It suggested that the war would not be decided in a single place, but through a series of actions that, taken together, could shape the outcome. Themistocles, whose earlier arguments had guided Athens toward naval power, understood the significance of what had happened. The delay at Thermopylae, brief as it might seem when measured against the scale of the campaign, had provided time to organize, to coordinate, to prepare for the next phase of the conflict. The fleet would soon face the Persian navy under conditions that might echo, in a different form, the advantage that the pass had provided on land. In Sparta, the news carried a different weight. The death of Leonidas was not unexpected, not in the context of the oracle that had preceded the campaign. Yet its reality settled into the city with a gravity that extended beyond strategy. A king had fallen, fulfilling the condition that had been spoken at Delphi. The cost had been paid, though its implications would continue to unfold. The response within Sparta did not erupt into visible mourning. The customs of the city shaped how such events were acknowledged. Yet the significance was understood deeply. The stand at Thermopylae had not been an isolated act. It had been part of a larger commitment, one that would now continue without the man who had led it. Across Greece, the alliance adjusted. The loss at the pass required a shift in position, a recognition that the next engagements would occur further south under different conditions. The defense would move, adapting to terrain, to opportunity, to the evolving shape of the Persian advance. Not all cities responded with renewed resistance. Some, seeing the fall of Thermopylae as confirmation of Persian strength, chose to submit. Earth and water were offered, decisions made that prioritized survival over independence. The Greek world did not move as a single, unified entity. It fractured, its responses shaped by local concerns, even as the larger conflict continued. Yet the story of the stand did not fade. It grew. Each retelling added weight, not by changing the outcome, but by emphasizing the manner in which it had been reached. The image of a small force holding a narrow pass against a larger army carried a clarity that extended beyond numbers. It became a reference point, a way of understanding what resistance could look like, even when victory was not immediate. For the Persian army, the passage through Thermopylae removed a barrier, but it did not remove the challenge ahead. The Greek fleet remained, positioned to contest control of the sea. The land beyond offered new terrain, new opportunities for defense. The campaign continued, its outcome still uncertain, despite the progress that had been made. The ground at Thermopylae itself did not change immediately. It remained marked by the battle, by the evidence of what had taken place there. In time, markers would be set, inscriptions placed to commemorate the dead, to give form to memory. But in the immediate aftermath, it was simply a place where men had stood and fallen, its significance carried away by those who had witnessed it and those who would hear of it. As the Persian army moved deeper into Greece, the echoes of the stand traveled with it. They reached cities preparing for defense, shaping expectations, influencing decisions. They reached those who had chosen submission, offering a contrast to the path they had taken. They reached the fleet, whose crews would soon face their own test under conditions that required the same discipline, the same coordination, the same willingness to hold under pressure. The war did not end at Thermopylae. It expanded, it shifted, it continued in ways that would define the future of the Greek world and the limits of Persian expansion. Yet within that larger story, the stand at the pass remained distinct. It was not the conclusion. It was a moment, a point where the conflict had been shaped in a way that could be understood, remembered, and carried forward. And as the road south filled once more with the movement of the Persian army, the memory of that moment moved with it, an echo that would not be silenced by the continuation of the march. Time did not pause at Thermopylae, but it changed the way the place was understood. The ground where the battle had been fought did not remain a battlefield forever. The bodies were cleared, the remnants of combat gradually removed or worn away by weather and passing seasons. Grass would return in places where blood had once soaked the earth. The path itself would remain, still narrow, still shaped by the same meeting of mountain and sea, but altered in meaning by what had occurred there. For those who had lived through the campaign, Thermopylae was not a distant story. It was a memory tied to specific moments, the sound of the first clash, the weight of the shield held against repeated blows, the sight of comrades standing and falling within the same confined space. Survivors carried these memories with them, shaping how they spoke of the battle when they returned to their cities. Their accounts were not identical. Each reflected the perspective of the one who told it, the details that had stayed with them, the elements that seemed most significant in retrospect. Over time, these accounts began to merge, to form a narrative that extended beyond individual experience. The differences between them did not disappear entirely, but they became less central than the shared themes that connected them. The narrow pass, the overwhelming numbers, the decision to stand. These elements provided a structure that allowed the story to be told and retold in ways that others could understand. In Sparta, the memory of Leonidas and the men who had remained at the pass was integrated into the city's existing framework of values. Their actions were not seen as an exception to Spartan identity, but as an expression of it. The discipline, the willingness to hold formation, the acceptance of death in service of the state, these were not new concepts. Thermopylae provided a clear example of them, one that could be referenced, taught, and used to reinforce what it meant to be Spartan. The oracle's words, spoken before the campaign, took on a different clarity in retrospect. What had been a conditional statement, either the city would fall or a king would die, now appeared fulfilled in a way that aligned with the outcome. Sparta endured. Leonidas had fallen. The connection between prophecy and event did not require further interpretation. It became part of the narrative, reinforcing the belief that the decision to stand had been shaped by forces beyond immediate strategy. In other Greek cities, the meaning of Thermopylae extended beyond Sparta. It became part of a broader understanding of the war, a moment that demonstrated both the cost of resistance and its possibility. The battle did not stop the Persian advance, but it delayed it. It did not secure victory, but it contributed to the conditions under which victory might later be achieved. This distinction mattered. It allowed the story to function not as a simple tale of defeat, but as something more complex. The Greeks could look to Thermopylae and see not only loss, but effort, an example of how a smaller force could impose limits on a larger one, how terrain and discipline could shape the outcome of an engagement even when the final result was determined by other factors. As the war continued, and as later victories at places like Salamis and Plataea shifted the balance against the Persian invasion, the memory of Thermopylae took on additional significance. It became part of a sequence, an early moment in a larger story that moved from resistance to eventual success. The stand at the pass could be understood as a beginning rather than an end, a necessary step in a process that required multiple engagements to resolve. Writers and poets began to give form to that memory. Herodotus, drawing on accounts gathered from different regions, recorded the events in a way that combined detail with narrative. His work did not present a single, unchallenged version of events. It included variations, acknowledged uncertainty, and attempted to preserve the complexity of what had occurred. Yet within that complexity, the outline of the story remained clear. Simonides, a poet, contributed in a different way. His epigrams, brief and carefully constructed, distilled the meaning of the stand into language that could be remembered easily. One such inscription, placed at the site, addressed those who had passed by in later years, a message that connected the dead to the laws of their city, that framed their actions within the expectations that had guided them. The words were simple, but their effect was lasting. They provided a way for memory to persist even as the immediate experience of the battle faded. The number 300, associated with the Spartan contingent, began to take on a symbolic quality. It did not represent the total number of defenders, nor did it capture the contributions of allies who had stood and fallen alongside them. Yet it offered a clear, defined image, small enough to emphasize the imbalance, distinct enough to be remembered. Over time, that number would come to dominate the story, shaping how it was told and understood. This process of shaping memory was not unique to Thermopylae. It reflected a broader pattern in how events were recorded and retold. Details were selected, emphasized, or simplified to create narratives that could be carried forward. What mattered was not only what had happened, but how it could be understood by those who had not been present. For later generations, Thermopylae became more than a historical event. It became a reference point, a way of thinking about resistance, about the relationship between individual action and collective outcome. The specifics of the battle, the arrangement of troops, the exact sequence of movements, remained important for those who studied it closely. But for many, the meaning lay in the broader themes it represented. The pass itself remained, its physical form largely unchanged despite the passage of time. Travelers could walk the same narrow ground, see the same relationship between mountain and sea. Imagine the line that had once been held there. Markers and monuments would be added, providing points of reference for memory, linking the present to the past. Yet even without those markers, the story would have endured. It had become part of a larger cultural memory, one that extended beyond geography. It was told in different places, in different forms, adapted to contexts that reflected the concerns of those who retold it. In this way, Thermopylae continued to exist, not only as a location, but as an idea. It represented a moment when a group of men chose to stand within limits that favored them, to resist a force that exceeded them, to accept an outcome that had been understood from the beginning. The battle itself had ended. The war had moved on. But the meaning of what had happened at that narrow pass did not remain fixed. It shifted, expanded, and endured, carried forward by those who saw in it something worth remembering, not because it changed the course of history in a single moment, but because it revealed how history could be shaped through decisions made under pressure, within constraints, and with an awareness of what those decisions might cost.